Hello, good day everyone. Welcome to our 6th annual international conference entitled Remembering Our Past. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Chelsea Syriac and my presentation today will focus on the transatlantic slave trade and most importantly the social and the cultural effects that resulted from this significant event that occurred in our history. This important the part of our history that shape what we are today. Right? So I'll start with an overview of the transatlantic slave trade. Right? The transatlantic slave trade began in the 16th century, right? And continued to as far as the 19th century. Right? It took place across the Atlantic Ocean, the entire Atlantic Ocean, where slaves were taken to the New World, many of them on the triangular trade route and also the Middle Passage. Now, this transatlantic slave trade was started by Portuguese traders, who decided to expand their trading of goods to more than just fine linen, these commodities, gold, right? To now capturing and trading in voluntary labor. So now they're trading people, right? Who they would use as to work on plantation mines, rice fields, cocoa fields, and other fields to replace the previous forms of labor that had failed. Right? They saw this as a solution to the problem that existed, where there was a shortage of labor because the previous forms of labor had died. They had a shortage of labor, and the Africans were seen as a more readily available commodity. They were right there and ready to work. They were available, right? So soon after the Portuguese now began trading, many others started to trade as well. Dutch, French, right? So the Africans were sold at very cheap prices and they were shipped immediately to the Americas, right? They started to trade Africans because the previous forms of labor, the indigenous people the first set of people who they came and meet, they were the initial sources of labor, but they were unreliable because many of them died from diseases. The Europeans were also quite unsuitable for this hot climate, right? And they suffered too from tropical diseases from the Caribbean. The Africans, however, they were strong and the most suitable workers. They could withstand the climate and any conditions, and they had numerous experience in agriculture and mining cattle, right? And they could also work very hard. They could work them, right? And get plenty profits out of them. They were resistant to all kinds of diseases. So all these advantages make them jump at the opportunity to use these Africans as slave labor, right? Slavery was not new to Africa, right? The Africans were captured and traded as slaves from centuries ago, so it was nothing new to them. However, the Atlantic slave trade was the largest slave trade in volume and intensity. It was large. Right, a large number of slaves were provided to Europeans and also to Muslim countries. The African continent, however, while the Europeans and the Muslim countries gained, the African continent was bled of its human resources. All the men taken, right, through all the possible routes they forced these people to travel across the Sahara, through the Red Sea, from the Indian Ocean ports, and across the Atlantic. These people were forced to travel. Right? These European traders would usually buy the enslaved Africans who were captured in native warfare between different African states. So those who were captured, they would buy them. Also, some Africans would capture their own people from neighboring ethnic groups and other war captives, right? And sell them to the Europeans for other things in exchange, other goods in exchange, other profit, to gain more profits, right? So the Atlantic slave trade was divided into two eras: the first Atlantic system and the second Atlantic system. The first Atlantic system was where the enslaved Africans were mainly traded to South American colonies, right? This accounted for 3% of the slave population, and they started in 1502 and it lasted till 1580, right? The second Atlantic system was where the Africans were mostly traded by the English, the Portuguese, the French, and the Dutch, right? And this accounted for a little more than 3% as well of the people taken, right? And this occurred between 1450 and 1600, right? And by the 17th century now, the amount of Africans traded had increased significantly. It had reached 16%. And by the 18th century was the greatest. The majority of slave trading took place in the 18th century. That's when the slave trade got big. Things got big. So the majority of slave trading took place in the 18th century. Right? So that is a little bit about the transatlantic trade. The triangular trade was also divided into 3 stages. There was the first stage, which involved taking manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, right, like cloth, spirit, tobacco. Then the second stage was the Middle Passage, and this involved the shipping of the slaves to the Americas. And then the third and final stage was the triangular trade. This is where the Europeans would return to Europe with all the profits they got from the forced labor. All the Africans' hard work, they returned with the profits to plantations. They got cotton, sugar, tobacco, molasses. And one thing to note is that the triangular trade got its name from the shape it formed on the map, or maps. It was a triangular shape. So this is an overview of the transatlantic trade. Now moving on to the social and cultural effects of the transatlantic slave trade. Right? What effects did this have on Africa? Right? Well, first of all, the death toll and economic, environmental destruction was startlingly high. The negative impact of the international slave trade on Africa was immense. Right? There were also famines that followed military actions, and this caused the old and the very young to often be killed. Right? There were also forced marches that caused the captives to die as well, because they were forced to march along long distances, right? Some were transported to Sahara, some stayed in Africa, right? The population of Africa, though, remained stagnant until the 19th century, when this thing was finally over. But during this thing, it strained Africa. There were also profound social and political changes. Social relations were restructured, traditional values were subverted completely. The slave trade resulted in the development of predatory regimes, right? Also, the relationships between kingdoms, ethnic groups, religious commodities, caste, rulers, subjects, all these different relationships transformed. European powers intervened in the political process to prevent the rise of the African centralized states that would have hampered the operations, right? The slave trade left the continent underdeveloped, disorganized, and vulnerable to the next phase, which is colonialism, the next phase of trade. Right? It also had rapes, frequent rapes, violence increased in the continent, right? Avoiding and resisting violence was determining characteristics of the responses of Africans. This is how they responded to forced migration experience, right? Also, though enslaved individuals came from widely different backgrounds and a number of different ethnic groups, and markers of identity were extensive, certain ethnicities, cultural groups, and languages maintained. Right, this Atlantic slave trade also resulted in American culture, which was neither European nor African. Right, there was a political and economic context of inequality and oppression. Okay, also sub-Saharan Africa lost over 12.5 million people to the transatlantic trade. A lot of people between 1525 and 1867. This is the extent of people that were lost during this trade. Right, so this is the effects that happened through this drastic transatlantic trade. In conclusion, the transatlantic slave trade, which took which began during the mid-16th century, took place as a result of Portuguese slave traders needing a strong workforce for plantations, mines, and fields, since previous forms of labor proved unsuccessful. It continued well into the 18th century in the majority of slave which is the century in which the majority of slave trading took place. Not only did this importation of a vast number of slaves cripple the economy of West Africa, but also resulted in a rampant death toll and a change in political and social structure, among other effects. Okay, so this is my presentation. It was short. I hope you enjoyed it. Are there any questions? Okay, if there aren't any questions, then I thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you understand where our history shaped where we are today. Okay, thank you.